Anselmo Vega woke, as he had for 11 years, at 4 in the morning, before the roosters, before the light, before anything in the valley of Santa Rosalia had decided whether it would be a good day or a bad one. He did not need an alarm. His body had learned the hour the way it had learned the ache in his left knee, the way it had learned to reach for a shoulder that was no longer there. He made coffee in the same blue-enameled pot Dolores had bought at the market in Concepcion 39 years before. The one with the small dent on its side where she had dropped it once, laughing, saying it would still make coffee just as well dented as whole. He measured exactly 2 spoons of ground coffee because 2 spoons had always been the right amount when there were 2 people to drink it, and he had never learned to make it any other way. Even now that he drank the whole pot alone, sitting on the porch, watching the sky over the orange trees turn from black to the color of a ripe guava. 14 rows. He counted them every morning, out of habit more than necessity, the way another man might count his money. 14 rows of orange trees, 312 trees in all, on 14 hectares of land his father had cleared with a mule and an axe 60 years ago, and that Anselmo himself had doubled in size with his own hands after his father died. The trees were old enough now that some of them leaned like tired men, and Anselmo understood them, because he leaned, too, on the cane of dark quebracho wood that Dolores had carved for him the year his knee first began to fail. Carved it herself, sanded it smooth, and told him that if he was going to grow old, he would at least do it holding something beautiful. He had built, over the years, a small press house at the edge of the grove, where 2 hired men came each season to help him turn the fruit into juice that he sold in glass bottles at the market in town. 30 pesos a bottle. 40 in the dry months when the trucks from the city could not get through. It was not a fortune. It had never needed to be. It had been enough, once, to raise a family on. Or it would have been, if there had been more of a family to raise. He had married Dolores when he was 23 and she was 20. They had been married 38 years before the fever took her, 11 years ago this coming September. And in those 38 years they had tried, for the first 9 of them, to have a child. Anselmo did not speak of those 9 years to anyone, not even now, not even to himself in the quiet of the morning, because some kinds of grief do not get smaller with age. They only get more familiar, like a stone you have learned to walk around in the dark without striking your foot. In the 10th year, when they had nearly stopped hoping, Dolores had given him a son. They named him Rafael, after Anselmo's father, and for 15 years the house had been full of a boy's noise, his boots on the wooden floor, his voice calling from the grove, his laughter at the dinner table when he told Anselmo that someday he would grow the biggest oranges in the whole province, bigger than his father's. And Anselmo would have to admit that his son had beaten him. Rafael did not get the chance. At 19, working a season in the quarry 2 towns over to save money for his own piece of land, a wall of stone came loose and buried him and 2 other men before anyone could reach them. Anselmo had gone to identify his son's body in a room that smelled of lime and diesel, and he had come home to Dolores and said nothing for 3 days, because there was nothing in the Spanish language, or in any language he knew, that could hold what he needed to say. That had been 15 years ago. Dolores had lived 4 more years after that, and Anselmo often thought, though he never said it aloud, that some part of her had died in that quarry alongside their son, and the rest of her had simply taken its time catching up. Since her death, the house had 2 rooms Anselmo did not open. One had been Dolores's sewing room, where her machine still sat under a sheet threaded with the last color of cotton she had used, a pale green she had been making into a shirt for a nephew who no longer wrote. The other was Rafael's room, and that door Anselmo had not opened in 11 years, not once, though he kept the key on the same ring as all his others, so that it hung against his hip every day of his life like a small, constant weight. This particular morning, the 14th of the dry season, though Anselmo did not think of it that way, He thought of it as the morning after he had finished pruning the north rose. He was on the porch with his coffee when he heard, from a long way off down the dirt road that led to his gate, the sound of feet. Not a truck, not a mule, not the mail carrier's bicycle. Feet, several pairs of them, and one of them small and uneven, the gait of a child too tired to walk properly but too proud or too well raised to be carried. He set down his cup and stood, leaning on the cane, and watched the road. It was nearly 6 miles from the crossroads at Piedra Alta, where the bus from the coast let people off, to Anselmo's gate. 6 miles of red dirt road that turned to a river of mud in the wet season and to a road of white dust in the dry one. 6 miles that a grown man on a good horse could do in an hour, but that a woman on foot, carrying a child and leading 2 others, could take most of a morning to walk. Rosa Elena Duarte had walked those 6 miles with her back straight the entire way. She was 33 years old, though grief and sun had put a few more years than that into the lines around her eyes. She had buried her husband, Emiliano, 8 months before, dead of a fever that came on fast in the rainy season and took him in 11 days, leaving her with a wooden trunk that held everything the family owned that could not be worn or eaten, and 3 children who had not yet learned that their father was not coming back from wherever it was that grown men went when they did not come home. The oldest, Tomas, was 11, a serious boy with his father's flat, steady way of looking at things, who had already, in the 8 months since Emiliano's death, learned to count and recount the family's small store of coins each night, dividing them in his head into what must be spent and what must be saved, though there was rarely enough of either to make the division meaningful. The middle child, Ines, was 8, and she was the opposite of her brother in nearly every way. Quick-fingered, curious, always making something out of nothing, dolls out of dried orange leaves and corn husks, little houses out of stones and mud that she populated with imaginary families far larger and happier than her own. She carried in a cloth bundle tied to her back 3 of these leaf dolls because she had refused to leave them behind, even when her mother told her the walk would be long. And the youngest, Pilar, was 4, and she understood almost nothing of what had happened to her family except that her father, whom she remembered only as a smell of tobacco and a pair of arms that used to lift her onto his shoulders, was now spoken of only in the past tense, and that her mother cried sometimes at night when she believed the children were asleep. Rosa Elena carried Pilar the last mile when the child's legs finally gave out, balanced on her hip along with the smaller of the 2 bundles the family had brought, a bundle of clothes, a few tools that had been Emiliano's, a Bible that had been his mother's, and nothing else, because Rosa Elena had made a decision back in the town where they used to live that she would not go anywhere carrying more than she could carry herself on her own 2 feet without anyone's help. She had heard of Anselmo Vega from a cousin who had once worked a season in his orange grove, heard that he was an old man, alone, hard but fair, with land enough to need help and no one left to give it to him. She had heard, too, that a man alone that long sometimes forgets how to want company and has to be reminded, gently but firmly, that wanting is not the same as asking, and that an offer made with dignity is not a burden, but a gift, if only he has the sense to see it that way. When she reached the gate and saw the old man standing on the porch, leaning on a dark wooden cane, watching her with an expression she could not yet read, she set Pilar down on her own feet, straightened her back further than the walk had already required, and did not wait for him to speak first. "Buenos dias, señor," she said. Her voice did not shake, though she had rehearsed this moment for 6 miles and still was not certain the words would come out steady. "My name is Rosa Elena Duarte. These are my children, Tomas, Ines, and Pilar. My husband died 8 months ago, and we have nowhere that is truly ours." Anselmo said nothing yet. He had learned, in 74 years, that silence was often the most honest thing a man could offer, and he offered it now, waiting to hear what kind of woman stood at his gate, the kind who begged or the kind who did not. Rosa Elena did not beg.
"I am not here to ask for charity," she said. "I can work. I have worked all my life, in the fields, in kitchens, wherever there was work to be done. My son can read a ledger and add a column of numbers faster than most grown men. My daughter has hands that can mend anything, and you—"
Here, for the first time, her voice caught, just slightly, and she let it, because some truths deserve to be spoken with a crack in the voice rather than a false steadiness.
"You have no one to close your eyes for you, Signor, when the day comes. And my children have never known a grandfather. They do not know what it is to have an old man's hand on their heads, or to hear stories about the time before they were born. I am asking you to let us trade our work, our company, our years, for a roof, and for the chance for my children to have that."
She stopped there. Behind her, Tomas stood with his chin lifted, trying to look older than 11. Ines held her bundle of leaf dolls against her chest, and Pilar, who understood none of the negotiation happening above her head, only that the walk was finally over, sat down in the dust of the road and began, very quietly, to hum a tune her father used to sing. Anselmo looked at the four of them for a long moment. He looked in particular at Rosa Elena's shoes, which were worn through at the toe, and at the straightness of her back despite it. And he thought of Dolores, who had once told him, the year they buried Raphael, when neighbors had come with baskets of food and pity in their eyes, that the hardest kind of poverty to bear with dignity was not having nothing, but having nothing and refusing still to let your back bend.
6 miles is a long walk for a child that size, he said at last, nodding toward Pilar sitting in the dust. "She did not complain," Rosa Elena said. "None of them did."
"No," Anselmo said. "I imagine they did not." He looked past her, down the long red road they had come by, empty now in the growing heat of the morning, and then back at the four faces in front of him. One hopeful in the guarded way of a woman who has learned not to hope too loudly. One trying to be brave. One curious despite everything. And one simply, blessedly, too young to be anything but tired. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He had spent 11 years learning that some doors, once opened too quickly, could not be closed again if he was wrong. And he was not a man who acted quickly on anything, not even joy, not even the possibility of it. "Come inside," he said instead. "You've walked far enough today without standing in my yard while I decide what kind of man I am." He turned toward the house, his cane finding the familiar grooves it had worn into the porch boards, and did not look back to see if they followed. Because some part of him, some old, unused part he had thought buried with his son, already knew that they would. Behind him he heard Rosa Elena murmur something to her children, low and quick, and then the sound of 4 pairs of feet on his porch steps. And for the first time in 11 years, the house that had been silent since Dolores died was about to hold, if only for one afternoon, the sound of a family that was not his own. Whether it would remain that way, whether he would open his gate the way he had just opened his door, all the way, without reservation, was a question Anselmo Vega could not yet answer, not even to himself. But as he set a second chair at his table and then, after a moment's hesitation, a third and a fourth, he understood that the answer had already begun, in some quiet way, to right itself. The first weeks were made of small collisions, the way any two households, however willing, must knock against each other before they learn each other's shape. Anselmo had lived alone so long that he had forgotten the sound of other people's habits, the particular way Rosa Elena hummed while she worked. Low, and almost without noticing she did it. The way Tomas rose before dawn without being asked and stood at the edge of the grove counting trees, as if counting were a kind of prayer he had inherited without ever being taught it. The way Ines left small things everywhere she went, a leaf twisted into the shape of a bird, a pebble balanced on a fence post, as though she could not pass through a place without leaving a small mark that said, "I was here. I noticed this." He found in the first days that he did not know what to do with his hands when there were other hands nearby to do the same work, and more than once he retreated to the press house alone, telling himself he was checking the machinery, when in truth he simply needed a room with no one else's breathing in it. He gave them Raphael's room to sleep in, not the locked one, which he did not offer and Rosa Elena did not ask about, sensing, with the instinct of a woman who has learned to read a house the way sailors read weather, that some doors in this home were not yet hers to knock on. But the smaller guest room that had once, briefly, belonged to a hired hand years ago, before Anselmo had begun doing most of the work himself out of habit more than necessity. It held one bed and one cot, and for the first nights, Rosa Elena and Pilar shared the bed while Tomas and Inés took turns on the cot and a pallet of blankets on the floor. No one complaining, because none of them, Anselmo came to understand, had ever known a floor that did not at some point become a bed. By the end of the first week, he had brought a second cot in from the press house, an old iron-framed thing that had belonged to one of his seasonal workers years back, and set it up himself, grunting with the effort of bending his bad knee, refusing Tomas's offer of help with a stubbornness that made the boy grin, the first real grin Anselmo had seen on him. Before the boy simply took hold of the other end of the frame anyway and helped him carry it in, and Anselmo let him, because a man could refuse help exactly once, before it became foolishness instead of pride. The children found their places in the rhythm of the grove faster than Anselmo expected. Tomas, true to his mother's word, had a mind for numbers that put Anselmo's own aging arithmetic to shame. Within 10 days, the boy had gone through the entire ledger of the press house, a battered notebook where Anselmo recorded, in a hand growing shakier each year, the bottles sold, the pesos earned, the wages owed to his two seasonal hands, Beto and Chucho, and had found, in a column near the back, an error that made him go very still and very serious before he brought it, without a word to anyone else first, to Anselmo on the porch. "Señor," Tomas said, holding the ledger out with both hands, the way a boy holds something he is afraid might be taken from him before he can explain it properly. "I think Beto has been marking down fewer crates than he actually presses. Look, here, the 11th of last month, he wrote 6 crates, but there are 7 deliveries logged the same week to the market, and the numbers don't add up unless there were 7 crates that day too." Anselmo took the ledger and studied it for a long while, his jaw working the way it did when he was deciding whether to be angry or simply tired. Beto had worked for him 9 seasons. It was not a small thing, a boy of 11 accusing a man of 9 seasons' loyalty of quiet theft, and Anselmo felt, for a moment, the old suspicion that had kept him solitary so long. The thought that perhaps this was exactly how such things began, a woman and her children arriving with open hands and closed intentions, planting doubt about the people who had served him faithfully so that they themselves might seem, by comparison, more trustworthy. He looked up and found the Rosa Elena standing in the doorway, having come out at the sound of Tomas's serious voice, and he watched her face carefully, the way he had learned, over a long life, to watch faces for the flicker that told a man whether he was being managed or simply told the truth. There was no flicker. There was only worry. Worry that her son had overstepped. Worry that Anselmo would think exactly what he was in that moment, thinking.
"Show him everything, Tomas," Rosa Elena said quietly. "All of it. Not just what looks bad for Beto. Everything. So the señor can judge for himself and not think we've come here to make trouble for people who've done nothing."
It took Anselmo 3 more days, checking the numbers himself against his own memory of deliveries and against a second count he made quietly, without telling anyone, of the crates actually stored in the press house, against what the ledger claimed had been sold. In the end, the numbers agreed with Tomas's arithmetic and not with Beto's ledger entries. And Anselmo understood, with a heaviness that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with disappointment in a man he had trusted.
That 9 seasons of loyalty had quietly become, in recent months, something less honest than that. He did not shout at Beto, nor did he humiliate him in front of the other workers. He called the man to the porch on a Sunday afternoon, laid the ledger between them, and asked him, plainly, to explain the difference between what was pressed and what was recorded. Beto's face went through several colors before he admitted that a cousin of his in the next town had been buying crates off the books, a few here and there, never so many at once that it would surely be noticed, the money going toward a debt Beto had been too ashamed to mention. Anselmo listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and when Beto finished, he told him only that the debt would be worked off in labor at a fair rate over the coming months, and that if it happened again, there would be no second conversation of this kind. Beto had nodded, red-eyed, and thanked him. Thanked him, Anselmo thought, more for the dignity of being spoken to plainly than for the leniency itself. That evening, once the children were asleep, Anselmo sat on the porch with his coffee gone cold in his hand and found Rosa Elena there too, mending one of Pilar's dresses by the light of the kitchen lamp spilling through the open door. "Your boy has a good eye," he said finally.
"He has had to,"
Rosa Elena said, not looking up from her needle.
"Since his father died, someone in the house had to learn to count what we had left, and I was too busy grieving to do it properly those first months. He took it on himself. I did not ask him to."
It is a heavy thing for a boy of 11 to carry.
"It is."
She tied off her thread and looked at him directly, the lamplight catching the tiredness in her face, and beneath it, something steadier. "But I would rather my children carry weights than carry nothing at all, Signor. A child who has never lifted anything heavy does not know his own strength when the day comes that he needs it." Anselmo did not answer that directly, but he thought about it for a long while after she had gone inside. And he thought, too, about the fact that she had told her son to show everything, the good and the bad both, rather than let the accusation against Beto stand alone and unquestioned. That she had chosen honesty, even when a lesser kind of person might have let a convenient silence do its work instead. He had spent 11 years assuming that anyone who arrived at his gate wanting something must, in some measure, be managing him toward it. He was beginning, slowly and against the grain of long habit, to consider that this might not always be true. Inés, meanwhile, had attached herself to the grove in a different way than her brother. Where Tomás counted, Inés noticed. She found within her first 2 weeks the particular tree at the end of the 9th row whose bark had a knot shaped, if you looked at it sideways, like a sleeping cat. And she began leaving small offerings there, a bright stone, a curl of orange peel, the way children invent private rituals that mean nothing to anyone but themselves, and everything to the small, unwitnessed architecture of their inner lives. She asked Anselmo, on her 3rd day, why some of the trees leaned more than others, and when he explained that the old ones simply tired with age, the way a man's back tires, she nodded solemnly and said that then the leaning trees must be the wisest ones, since they had lived long enough to have something to lean from. Anselmo, caught off guard by this, had laughed, a short, rusty sound, unused in 11 years, that startled him nearly as much as it seemed to startle Inés, who looked up at him with wide, pleased eyes, as though she had discovered something rare. It was Pilar, though, who did what neither the ledger nor the leaning trees could do. On the 9th evening, after supper, the household had gathered on the porch in the cooling air. Anselmo in his usual chair, Rosa Elena mending by lamplight, Tomás going over the day's tally in his head, Inés arranging pebbles into a small crooked house at the porch's edge. Anselmo had been sitting a little apart from all of it, as he had every evening so far, present but not quite joined, a man watching a family from just outside its circle the way he might watch weather move across a distant field. Pilar, who had been playing near her mother's feet, grew sleepy the way small children do, all at once,
and without warning. And rather than go into a mother who was occupied with her needle, or to either of her older siblings who were absorbed in their own small worlds, she crossed the porch on her unsteady 4-year-old legs, climbed without asking anyone's permission because it had not occurred to her that permission might be needed, into Anselmo's lap, and was asleep against his chest within a minute, her small fist curled into the front of his shirt. Anselmo went rigid. He looked, first in alarm and then in something closer to panic toward Rosa Elena, silently asking whether he should move the child, wake her, hand her back. He did not know the protocol for a stranger's daughter falling asleep in his arms, had not held a sleeping child since Raphael was small enough to carry, and the sensation of that small weight against him, the particular trusting heaviness of a sleeping child who has decided, without any of the reasoning grown people require, that this is a safe place to stop being awake, undid something in him that 11 years of solitude had built very carefully, brick by brick, around the parts of himself that could still be undone. Rosa Elena, watching, made no move to take her daughter back.
She does that, she said softly, when she trusts someone. She did it with her father from the time she could crawl. She has not done it with anyone since he died.
Anselmo did not answer. He could not, for a moment, trust his voice. He sat very still, one hand coming to rest, almost without his own permission, on the small back rising and falling against him. And he looked out at the dark rows of orange trees, and for the first time in 11 years, he wept. Not loudly, not in a way that would wake the sleeping child or draw attention from the others, but quietly, the tears simply arriving and being allowed to fall, because there are some griefs that do not release their grip through anger or through time, but only through the accident of a small hand curled trustingly into a shirt that has not, in longer than the child had been alive, held anything so precious. Rosa Elena said nothing more. She simply went on mending, giving him the privacy of her attention turned elsewhere, and Tomas and Ines, sensing, without understanding, that something important and fragile was happening on the porch, grew quiet too. And the four of them sat together in the dark, in a silence that was, for the first time since Rosa Elena had walked up the red dirt road with her back straight and her children behind her, something closer to peace than to negotiation. It was Anselmo who finally spoke, once he had found his voice again, once Pilar's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of real sleep. 31, he said quietly. Rosa Elena looked up, not understanding. 31 years, he said, since I held a sleeping child. My son, Raphael. He used to fall asleep in the wagon coming back from town, and I would carry him in on my shoulder so his mother could open the door. He paused, his hand still resting on Pilar's back. I had forgotten the weight of it. I had forgotten a person could weigh exactly this much and still feel like the heaviest thing in the world. Rosa Elena set down her mending. You do not have to tell me about him, she said gently, if it is not something you wish to share. But if you ever do wish to, I am not afraid to hear it. And Selma nodded once and said nothing more that night. But something in the offer, the plainness of it, the absence of pity, the simple statement that she was not afraid, settled into him the way water settles into dry ground after a long drought. Not all at once, but steadily, finding every crack that had been waiting unacknowledged for exactly this. He carried Pilar to bed himself that night, refusing gently Rosa Elena's offer to take her, and laid the sleeping child down on the cot beside her siblings with a care that surprised even him, tucking the blanket around her small shoulders the way he remembered doing for a boy who had been dead now 15 years. And if his hands shook a little as he did it, no one in the room was awake to see. Let me stop here for just a moment, because I think you deserve the chance to answer this before I go on. An old man, 11 years alone, a stranger's child asleep against his chest for the first time since his own son died. Would you have let her stay there? Or would fear of getting attached again have made you hand her back?
Tell me in the comments. Now, back to the grove. The days that followed settled into something that was not yet a routine but was beginning to resemble the shape of one. Chucho, the second hired man, older than Beto by a decade and quieter by nature, took to the children with an ease that surprised Anselmo. He had, it turned out, 6 grandchildren of his own in a town 3 hours north, whom he saw perhaps twice a year, and something in him seemed grateful for the chance to teach Tomas how to graft a young branch onto an older rootstock, showing the boy's careful hands exactly where to cut, exactly how to bind the wound with wet cloth and wax so the 2 pieces of wood would learn, over a season, to become 1 tree instead of 2. Inés, for her part, discovered the kitchen. Rosa Elena cooked the way she did everything else, without waste and without complaint, turning whatever the grove and the small garden behind the house provided into meals that stretched further than Anselmo would have thought possible. And Inés watched her mother's hands with the same fierce attention she gave to the knot in the 9th row tree, until one evening she asked, very seriously, if she might be allowed to make the tortillas herself. All the way from mixing the masa to setting them on the comal. And Rosa Elena, recognizing in her daughter's request the same hunger to be useful that had carried the whole family 6 miles down a dirt road, said yes, and stood back and let her daughter burn the first 3 before she got the 4th exactly right. Anselmo noticed, without quite meaning to keep count, that he had stopped eating alone. He noticed that the coffee pot, still measured at 2 spoons out of old habit, now had to be refilled twice each morning instead of once, because there were 5 mouths at his table instead of 1, and that this fact, which should perhaps have felt like an imposition on a solitary man's careful economies, felt instead like the correction of an error he had lived inside for so long he had stopped recognizing it as an error at all. By the end of the 3rd week, when Rosa Elena asked him, hesitantly, whether he thought it might be time to speak with the schoolmaster in the nearby settlement about enrolling Tomas and Inés, Pilar being still too young, Anselmo found that he had already, without quite deciding to, begun thinking of the answer not as a question about strangers who happened to be living under his roof, but as a question about his own family's children. And he said yes, of course, immediately, and offered to walk with her into town himself to make the arrangements, leaning on his cane, taking the long way so that the 6 miles would feel shorter with company beside him than it ever had walked alone.
It was Inés who found the key.
She had not been looking for it. That was the truth, she told her mother afterward, tearfully, certain she had done something wrong, though in fact she had only been doing what she always did, noticing things other people walked past without seeing. She had been dusting, a chore Rosa Elena had assigned her that week, running a cloth along the top of the tall wardrobe in the hallway outside Anselmo's own room, when her fingers found, tucked into a gap between the wardrobe's crown and the wall, a single brass key, old and slightly tarnished, resting where it must have sat undisturbed for a very long time. She should have brought it straight to her mother. She knew this, even at 8 years old, in the way children often know the correct action and choose the more interesting one instead. Instead, she carried the key down the hallway to the one door in the house that had, since the day they arrived, remained locked. A door she and her siblings had been told gently but firmly not to trouble the señor about. A door that Rosa Elena herself had never once tried, out of a respect for boundaries that ran deeper in her than curiosity ever could. Inés was 8. Respect for boundaries was a thing she was still learning, the way she was still learning her multiplication tables, imperfectly and with occasional lapses. The key turned. The door swung open on a hinge that had not moved in 11 years, and the room beyond it exhaled the particular stillness of a place time had stepped around rather than through. Dust suspended in a shaft of afternoon light, a narrow bed made up with a quilt gone pale at its folds, a shelf of small carved animals, a boy's boots standing by the door as though their owner had only just stepped out of them and would be back any moment to put them on again. And in the corner, half covered by a cloth that had slipped from one side, a wooden crib. It was beautifully made, Ines could see that, even without knowing anything about carpentry, could see it in the smoothness of the rails, the careful curve of the rockers, a small carved bird on the headboard with wings spread as though caught mid-flight. It was also, unmistakably, unused. The wood held none of the wear a real crib gathers from years of small hands gripping its rails. No scuff marks, no softened edges. It sat in the corner of a dead boy's room, the way a promise sits in a drawer when the person it was made to would never come to collect it. Ines did not understand any of this. She understood only that it was beautiful, and that it was sad in a way she did not have words for yet. And she was still standing in the doorway, one hand resting on the crib's rail, when she heard the particular rhythm of Anselmo's cane on the hallway floor behind her, and turned to find him standing there, having come in from the grove earlier than expected, staring at the open door of his son's room for the first time in 11 years. For a long moment he said nothing. Ines, seeing something in his face that frightened her more than any scolding could have, began at once to apologize, the words tumbling over each other. She had found the key. She hadn't meant to. She would put everything back exactly as it was. Please don't be angry with Mama. It wasn't her fault. She hadn't told anyone. Hush, Anselmo said, but not unkindly. He came into the room slowly, his cane finding the floor with a caution that had nothing to do with his knee, and stood beside her, looking down at the crib as though seeing it for the first time in years, which, in a way that mattered, he was. I made this, he said finally, before my son was born. I did not know then whether it would be a boy or a girl, so I carved a bird instead of anything else, because a bird can belong to either. He touched the small wings on the headboard with one finger, very lightly, the way a man touches something he is afraid might crumble under too much weight. By the time Raphael came, I had another crib already. His mother's family had one, passed down, plainer than this. I kept meaning to use this one for the next child. There was always going to be a next child, we thought, once Raphael came at last after so many years of waiting. There was time, we thought. He was quiet for a moment. Ines, very still now, did not interrupt. There was no next child, he said. And then there was no first child either, not after he was 19. And I never opened this door again, because everything in it was a room full of people who were supposed to still be here. And I did not have it in me to look at all that's supposed to, and know it would never happen. Ines, who was 8, and who did not yet fully understand the difference between a grief that could be comforted and a grief that could only be witnessed, did the only thing that occurred to her. She reached out and took Anselmo's free hand in both of hers, the way she might have taken her own mother's hand crossing a road, and said nothing at all. Because for once, even Ines understood that this was not a moment for words. Rosa Elena found them there a few minutes later, having come looking for her daughter when the dusting cloth turned up abandoned in the hallway. She stood in the doorway, taking in the open room, the crib, the old man and the little girl standing together beside it. And she did not ask what had happened, because the scene explained itself.
I'm sorry, senor,
she said quietly.
I told the children this room was not theirs to enter. Ines will apologize properly, and it will not happen again.
No, Anselmo said, and his voice, when it came, was steadier than either of them expected. Leave the door open. It has been closed long enough, longer than it should have been. He looked around the room once more, the boots by the door, the carved animals on the shelf, the crib with its unflown bird, and something in his shoulders, some tension held so long it had become invisible even to himself, seemed to ease, just slightly, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. This was my son's room, he said. His name was Raphael. He would have been 34 this year if the quarry hadn't taken him. Perhaps if things had gone differently, he would have had children of his own by now, and this crib might finally have been used.
He paused. It seems it was simply waiting for the right family to arrive. However, that family came to me. He walked slowly to the shelf of carved animals and picked up, with great care, a small wooden horse, its paint long faded, one ear chipped from some forgotten childhood accident. I carved these for him one at a time, one for every birthday until he was too old to want them anymore. Though he never let me throw a single one away, even at 19. He kept them lined up on this shelf exactly as you see them now. I think, if I am honest,
Some part of me kept this room shut, not because I could not bear to look at it, but because I was afraid that if I opened the door and rearranged even one of these horses, I would be admitting that he was truly not coming back to put them in order himself. He set the horse down again in precisely the spot from which he'd lifted it, and for a moment his hand lingered on its faded mane. 11 years, he said, and I told myself I was protecting his memory by keeping the door shut. I understand now that I was only protecting myself from having to feel, all at once, everything I had spent 11 years feeling, a little at a time instead. Ines, still holding his other hand, looked up at him. Was he a good brother? She asked, and then, catching herself, I mean, would he have been, if he'd had one? The question, so simply and unguardedly put, seemed to move something in Anselmo that a more careful adult question might not have reached. I believe he would have been, he said. He was patient with small things. He once spent an entire afternoon teaching a neighbor's boy, younger than you are now, how to whistle through a blade of grass, when he could have been off doing anything else a boy of 15 wanted to do instead. He did not say more than that. He did not need to. Rosa Elena understood, and later that evening, when she told Tomas and Pilar what had happened, she made certain they understood too. That the room was no longer forbidden, that its sadness was not a secret to be tiptoed around, but a truth the whole household now shared the weight of carrying, together, which is a very different thing from carrying it alone. In the days that followed, without anyone quite deciding it should happen, the door to Raphael's room stayed open. Anselmo did not move the crib, nor the boots, nor the row of small wooden horses, but he did, one evening, invite Pilar to sit with him on the narrow bed while he told her, in simple words suited to a 4-year-old's understanding, about a boy who had once slept in that very room, and who would have loved, he told her, to have a little sister exactly like her. Pilar, who understood loss mostly as an absence rather than a story, listened with the grave attention small children give to things they sense are important, even when they cannot follow every word. And when Anselmo finished, she patted the quilt beside her and said, with the devastating simplicity of the very young, "He can still be my brother. I don't mind that I never met him." Anselmo had to look away toward the window for a moment before he trusted himself to answer her. The second crisis of that season came without warning, the way such things nearly always do. It was late in the harvest, the busiest weeks of the year, when the trees gave up their fruit all at once and the press house ran from before dawn until after dark, crates stacking up faster than Beto and Chucho alone could manage, even with Tomas's help keeping the tally straight. Anselmo, who had worked every harvest of his adult life without much thought to his own body's limits, had been on his feet since before sunrise, moving crates, checking the press, arguing gently with a buyer from the coast about the price per bottle, when he felt, quite suddenly, a tightness gather in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with something going wrong deep inside him. He did not fall. He had the presence of mind, even as the world narrowed and grayed at its edges, to lower himself onto an overturned crate rather than collapse onto the packed dirt floor. And it was in that half-sitting, half-slumped position that Tomas found him, gray-faced and gripping his own left arm, unable to finish a sentence he had started. What happened in the next hour would be told and retold in the Vega household for years afterward, though never in Anselmo's presence. Out of a tact the children learned without being taught it. Tomas, 11 years old, did not panic. He had spent 8 months since his own father's death learning, in the hardest possible school, what panic accomplished and what it did not. And so instead of screaming or freezing, he ran the full length of the grove to the house, calling for his mother before he had even reached the porch. And by the time Rosa Elena reached the press house, moving faster than she had moved since the 6-mile walk that first brought her to this gate, Tomas had already sent Chucho on the fastest horse to fetch the doctor from the crossroads settlement, and had propped Anselmo's back against a stack of crates and was holding the old man's wrist between 2 fingers, the way he had once seen a traveling nurse do, counting silently, keeping his own voice low and steady, even though his hands, Rosa Elena would notice later, had been shaking the entire time. "Stay with me, senor," he kept saying over and over, in a voice he had clearly decided somewhere in the running must not be allowed to break. "The doctor is coming. Stay with me." The doctor, when he arrived nearly 2 hours later, pronounced it a mild cardiac event, not the massive failure it might have been, but a clear warning, he said, that a man of 74 who had spent 50 years working a grove with his own 2 hands could not go on pretending his body owed him the same labor it had given at 30. Rest, he said, lighter work, someone to share the burden that had, for 11 years, fallen on one pair of hands alone. It was Rosa Elena and the children who carried the harvest home in the 2 weeks that followed, while Anselmo, furious at his own uselessness and forbidden by the doctor and by his own body, both from doing more than sit on the porch and direct operations with increasingly irritable instructions, watched from his chair as a woman he had known for barely 2 months and 3 children who were not his blood kept his life's work from spoiling in the crates. Rosa Elena rose before the sun and worked the press herself, her hands, though unused to that particular machine, learning its rhythm within a day, because she had learned long ago that any unfamiliar work became familiar quickly enough if a person simply refused to be defeated by the first difficulty of it. Tomas kept the ledger with an accuracy that made even Beto, chastened and grateful for the second chance he'd been given, remark that the boy had a better head for figures than most grown men he'd worked beside. Inés, too young for the heavier work, took over the household entirely, cooking, tending Pilar, running messages between the press house and the porch where Anselmo sat, and somehow, in the gaps of all of this, still finding time to leave a fresh stone or a curled leaf at the base of the 9th row tree, as though even in crisis, some rituals could not be abandoned. The final tally, when Tomas read it aloud from the ledger on the last evening of the harvest, came to 218 crates pressed, 4,360 bottles filled and corked, and only 11 bottles lost to breakage in the whole 2 weeks. A number so close to the previous year's total, achieved by hands that had never touched that particular press before this season began, that even Beto, listening from the doorway, let out a low whistle of something like respect. By the time the last crate was pressed and the last bottle corked 2 weeks later, the harvest had come in nearly complete. A little smaller than the previous years, but whole, sold, and accounted for to the last peso. And Anselmo, sitting on his porch watching the empty crates being stacked for storage, understood something he had not fully let himself understand before that crisis. That this family had not simply moved into his house. They had, in the space of 2 difficult weeks, taken up the actual weight of his life's work and carried it without being asked twice, without complaint, and without once suggesting, even by implication, that this labor entitled them to anything beyond what he had already freely offered them. "You did not have to do all of that," he told Rosa Elena that evening, once the last of the crates were stacked and the children, exhausted, had gone early to bed. "Yes," she said simply, sitting beside him on the porch step. "I did. You gave us a roof and a place at your table before you knew what kind of people we were. It seemed a poor sort of gratitude to let your life's work rot in the sun while you recovered from nearly losing it." And Selma looked at her for a long moment in the gathering dark.
My son used to say something like that, he said, that a debt of kindness paid back in words alone was not really paid at all.
Your son sounds like he was raised right.
He was raised by his mother, mostly, Anselmo said, and there was, for the first time since Inez had opened that locked door, something almost like a smile in his voice. I was only ever good for the orange trees.
Rosa Elena looked out at the dark rows of the grove, quiet now after the frenzy of harvest, and said nothing more, letting the silence between them hold what it needed to hold, which by now, after 2 months and a crisis weathered together, had become a good deal more than either of them had expected that first morning at the gate it ever could. Beto, for his part, marked that harvest as the season he earned back something he had nearly lost for good. He worked the 2 weeks of Anselmo's convalescence without being asked twice, staying an hour past dark most nights to make certain the press was clean and ready for morning. And when the old man was finally strong enough to walk the rows again, Beto met him at the gate of the press house, hat in hand, and said only that he hoped the señor would allow him to keep proving himself, season after season, for as long as there were oranges left to press. Anselmo, who had never been a man for long speeches, clasped the younger man's shoulder and told him that a debt honestly repaid was worth more to him than a debt never owed in the first place. And the two of them understood each other well enough that nothing further needed saying. Tomas, too, carried something forward from those 2 weeks that no ledger could measure. The doctor, who had come from the crossroads settlement, seeing how steadily the boy had managed the crisis, told Rosa Elena privately that she had raised a son with the calm of a man 3 times his age. And though Tomas overheard none of this, something in the way the household treated him afterward, a little more consultation, a little more trust handed to him without his having to ask for it, told him, in the wordless way children read a household's shifting currents, that he had crossed some threshold in Anselmo's estimation that could not be uncrossed. He began from that point on keeping a second ledger alongside the first, a small private notebook of his own where he recorded in his careful hand not pesos and crates, but the things he wanted to learn before he was grown. How to graft 3 kinds of citrus onto 1 rootstock, how to read the sky for the first hard rain of the season, how to write a letter formal enough to send to a bank. He did not show this notebook to anyone, not even his mother, but he kept it under his pillow at night, the way another boy might keep a treasure, because in his own quiet way, Tomas had begun to understand that he was not merely surviving in this household. He was, for the first time since his father's death, being given room to grow into something. Word of the changes at the Vega Grove traveled the way such things always travel in small places. Slowly, at first, carried by a market vendor here, a cousin's letter there, and then, all at once, the way a rumor gathers speed once enough people have repeated it. By the time 6 months had passed since Rosa Elena first walked up the red dirt road, most of Santa Rosalia knew that old Anselmo Vega had taken in a widow and her 3 children, that the press house was running better than it had in years, that the old man had been seen, of all things, laughing on his own porch of an evening. It was perhaps inevitable that word would eventually travel the 200 miles to the city and reach the ears of Braulio Vega. Braulio was Anselmo's cousin's son, a connection distant enough that the 2 men had met perhaps a dozen times in their lives, mostly at funerals, the last of which had been Dolores's 11 years before, when Braulio had stayed exactly as long as propriety required and not 1 hour more. He worked in the city as a land broker, a trade that had taught him to see every hectare he encountered, family or otherwise, primarily in terms of its resale value. And in the 6 years since that funeral, he had sent Anselmo, by Anselmo's own count, exactly 2 letters. One asking with transparent casualness whether the old man had ever considered what would happen to the grove when the time came, and one, 3 years later, informing him without being asked that land prices in the region were rising and that Anselmo might do well to have the property properly appraised. Anselmo had answered neither letter. He had understood, without needing to be told outright, exactly what kind of interest Braulio was expressing, and he had not seen any reason to encourage it with a reply. Now, with new rumors of a widow, 3 children, and a warming old man reaching Braulio's ears through the same gossip channels that carried everything else, the younger man's interest sharpened considerably. A stranger and her children settling into a childless old man's household was not, to a man who thought primarily in terms of inheritance and appraisal, an innocent development. It was a variable that needed managing. He arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon in a car that was too clean for the dusty road it had traveled, dressed in city clothes entirely unsuited to a working grove, and found Anselmo on the porch with Pilar asleep in his lap. A sight so different from the solitary old man of his memory that Braulio actually paused at the gate for a moment before composing his face into an expression of familial warmth he had clearly practiced on the drive out. "Cousin," he said, using the word with an ease that did not match the 6 years of silence behind it. "It has been too long." Anselmo studied him for a moment before answering, careful not to disturb the sleeping child in his lap. "It has," he agreed, in a tone that offered no particular warmth in return. Braulio's eyes moved in the practiced, cataloging way of a man used to assessing property, over the porch, the house, the rows of orange trees visible beyond it, and finally, with only slightly less obviousness, over Rosa Elena, who had come to the door at the sound of an unfamiliar car and now stood in the doorway with Tomas and Inés flanking her, all 3 regarding the visitor with the particular wariness of people who have learned, through hard experience, to notice when a stranger's smile does not reach his eyes. "I heard you had company," Braulio said, choosing the word with visible care. "I confess I was concerned, cousin. A man your age, alone as you've been, one hears of people taking advantage. Rosa Elena Duarte and her children live here because I invited them to," Anselmo said evenly. "There has been no taking advantage that I am aware of, unless you count the advantage of good company after 11 years without it." Of course. Braulio's smile did not waver, but something calculating moved behind it. "It's only that these things can become complicated. Legally, I mean. A man wants to be careful about what he signs, who he trusts with his affairs, especially when there's property involved. 14 hectares, isn't it? Prime grove land, this close to the new highway route they're surveying. I only say this out of concern for the family name, cousin. I'd hate to see anything happen to what our grandfather built, simply because you were generous with the wrong people." Anselmo felt Rosa Elena's gaze on him from the doorway, felt the careful stillness with which she and her children were absorbing every word of this conversation, and he was aware, in a way that steadied rather than angered him, that this was a moment that would tell them a great deal about what kind of man he truly was. Whether the last 6 months had been an aberration he would abandon at the first challenge from his own blood, or something he intended to stand behind. "The family name," Anselmo said slowly, "has not been troubled by anyone in this house, Braulio. I have run this grove for over 50 years without needing your concern for it, and I intend to continue running my own affairs the same way. If you've driven 200 miles to inquire after my health, I thank you for the visit. If you've come to inquire after my land, you may save yourself the trouble of pretending otherwise." The directness of it seemed to catch Braulio off guard, though he recovered quickly, spreading his hands in a gesture of wounded innocence. "I only want what's best for you, cousin, and for the family, of course. It would be a shame to see everything grandfather built pass to strangers, when there's family who could—" "Family," Anselmo interrupted, quietly but with an edge that made even Braulio pause. "Sends more than 2 leathers in 6 years, and neither of those leathers asked after my health, only after my land. I know the difference, Braulio, between a man who visits because he cares and the man who visits because he's heard there might be something worth visiting for. I am 74 years old, not senile,
And I would ask you not to insult either of us by pretending this is anything other than what it plainly is.
Braulio's composure slipped, just slightly at that. A tightening around the eyes, quickly smoothed over. I only meant, he began, then seemed to reconsider his approach entirely, his tone shifting from wounded concern to something with a harder edge beneath its politeness. You're an old man, living alone with a woman and her children who have no legal claim to anything here, cousin. I'm simply saying that if something were to happen to you, and forgive me,
But at your age, and with your heart as I understand it's given you trouble recently, this family would have every right to contest whatever arrangement you might be considering. I would hate for there to be unpleasantness.
there it was. The mask, thin as it had been, was down now, and what remained beneath it was plainer than anything Braulio had said before. Not concern, not family feeling, but a warning, delivered in the language of a man who dealt in contested land every working day of his life and knew exactly how such disputes could be dragged out, made expensive, made exhausting enough that even a rightful claim might be abandoned simply to be free of the fight. Anselmo did not raise his voice. He had learned over a long life that the calmest response to a threat was often the one that unsettled the person making it the most. I appreciate you being honest with me at last, he said. It makes this conversation considerably shorter. I will tell you what I told the widow who came to my gate 6 months ago and asked for nothing but a fair trade. I do not do anything in my house or on my land out of fear of what someone might say about it later.
Whatever arrangements I choose to make for what happens to this grove when I am gone, I will make them the same way I have made every decision on this land for 50 years. Carefully, legally, and without needing anyone's permission, least of all yours. Braulio's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed he might say something further, something less carefully worded than what had come before. But whatever calculation ran behind his eyes seemed to conclude that little more could be gained from continuing to press the point in front of witnesses who were, Anselmo noted, listening to every word. He stood, straightened his city jacket with a gesture that seemed designed to reclaim some measure of dignity from an encounter that had not gone the way he'd planned, and looked once more, briefly, toward Rosa Elena and the children in the doorway, an expression crossing his face that none of them could quite read. Not quite anger, not quite calculation. Something colder and more patient than either. I only came out of concern, cousin, he said again, though the warmth had entirely gone from the words now, leaving only their bare, unconvincing shape. I hope you won't come to regret not taking that concern more seriously. These things have a way of becoming complicated once lawyers are involved, and I promise you, if there's a claim to be made when the day comes, I intend to make it. He got back into his too-clean car without waiting for a response and drove away down the red dirt road in a cloud of dust that seemed, to everyone watching from the porch, considerably less dignified than the walk Rosa Elena and her children had made along that same road 6 months before. No one on the porch spoke for a long moment after the sound of the car had faded. "Will he come back?" Tomas asked finally, his voice carefully even in the way Anselmo had come to recognize as the boy's particular method of managing fear, flattening it into a question that could be answered with facts rather than feelings. Anselmo looked down the empty road for a moment before answering, Pilar still asleep against his chest, entirely undisturbed by a confrontation that would, he suspected, matter a great deal to her own future. "Yes," he said finally. "Men like Braulio do not let go of a thing simply because they're told no once. He will be back when he judges the timing better for himself.
He looked up at Rosa Elena, standing very still in the doorway, her face carefully composed, but her eyes betraying the same worry Anselmo felt settling into his own chest. But he will find, when he returns, that I have not spent the time since his visit waiting to see what he does.
I intend to see the lawyer in town this week.
Oh! It was not a promise made lightly, and everyone on that porch understood it as exactly what it was. Not the end of the trouble Braulio represented, but the true beginning of it. The first move in a contest that would not, Anselmo knew with the particular clarity of a man who had just been plainly threatened by his own blood, be settled by one uncomfortable Sunday visit alone. He kept his word within the week. On Wednesday, once the morning's work at the press house was finished, Anselmo asked Tomas to hitch the mule to the small cart and rode the 6 miles into town himself, refusing Rosa Elena's offer to accompany him, not out of any wish to exclude her, but because he had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours after Braulio's visit, that this particular errand was one he needed to walk into on his own 2 feet, or as near to his own 2 feet as his cane and a borrowed cart would allow, so that whatever he arranged could never later be characterized by Braulio or anyone else as the doing of a woman who had talked an old man into signing away his land. The lawyer in Santa Rosalia was a careful, unhurried man named Ignacio Ferreira, who had handled Anselmo's father's affairs before him, and had watched 3 generations of the town's families argue over considerably smaller inheritances than 14 hectares of citrus grove. He listened to the whole of what Anselmo wanted, not a simple will, which any determined relative could contest in court by arguing undue influence over a lonely old man, but something sturdier, a formal labor agreement, backdated to acknowledge the work Rosa Elena and her children had already performed, specifying wages, specifying duties, and specifying, in language Ferreira assured him would hold up against any challenge a city lawyer could mount, that the grove and the press house would pass to Rosa Elena Duarte and her 3 children upon Anselmo's death, not as a gift, but as compensation earned through years of documented labor and care. You understand, Ferreira said, adjusting his spectacles as he made notes, that a relative like the one you describe may still contest this. Blood relations have certain protections under the law, even distant ones, if they can convince a judge the deceased was not of sound mind or was unduly pressured. To make certain there is no room for that argument, Anselmo said, I want a doctor's letter attesting to my mental competence, dated this same week. I want witnesses to my signature who have no relation to the Duarte family and no benefit from the arrangement. You can find me 2 such men in this town easily enough. And I want the agreement to state plainly, in its very first line, if you can manage it, that this was my idea, brought to your office by my own hand, on my own 2 feet, with no one from that family present in the room. Ferreira, who had handled enough disputed inheritances to recognize a client thinking 3 moves ahead of trouble rather than 1, allowed himself a small, approving nod. You've clearly given this some thought, Don Anselmo. I've had a visit from my cousin, Anselmo said dryly. It concentrates the mind. The paperwork took the better part of 3 weeks to prepare properly. The doctor's letter, the witnessed signing, a formal inventory of the grove's assets down to the number of trees and the value of the press house equipment. All of it assembled with a thoroughness that Ferreira assured him would leave a challenger very little room to maneuver. Anselmo said nothing of the details to Rosa Elena during this time, not out of secrecy, but out of a wish. He told her only once it was finished, to present her with something complete, rather than something half-formed and worrying. When at last he called her into the small front room he used for household business and laid the signed and witnessed documents on the table between them, Rosa Elena read through the pages slowly, her lips moving slightly the way they did when she worked through difficult sums. And when she reached the clause naming her and her 3 children as the grove's future owners, she looked up at him with an expression that held more alarm than gratitude.
Señor, this is too much. We came here for a roof and a chance for the children to know an old man's kindness, not for land. I did not ask for this, and I do not want you to feel you must give it because Braulio frightened you into it.
I do not do things because I am frightened, Rosa Elena, Anselmo said, using her given name for what both of them realized in that moment was the first time since her arrival. I do them because I have thought about them carefully and decided they are right. You did not ask for this land. You earned it, you and your children, with 2 weeks of harvest carried on your own backs while I sat useless on this porch, with careful nights of arithmetic done to protect an old fool from a dishonest worker, with a little girl who found the courage to sit beside me in a dead boy's room instead of running from my grief. This is not charity, and I will not have you treat it as such. It is wages, long overdue, for work you have already done and will go on doing. Rosa Elena said nothing for a long moment, her eyes bright, and when she finally spoke, her voice was not entirely steady. Then I accept it, she said. Not as a gift, but, as you say, as wages honestly earned. And I promise you, Senor, that whatever years you have left, this family will earn them again and again, so that you never once regret the trust you've placed in us. Anselmo, satisfied, folded the papers carefully and locked them, along with a second key he had cut for exactly this purpose, in the same drawer where he kept Dolores's wedding ring and the last letter Raphael had ever written him. It was not, he knew, the end of the matter. Braulio's threat still hung over the household like weather gathering on the horizon, visible, but not yet arrived. But for the first time since that Sunday visit, Anselmo felt he had done everything within his power to meet the storm prepared, whenever it finally chose to break. Braulio returned in the spring, 8 months after his first visit, and this time he did not bother with the pretense of family concern. He arrived again, unannounced, though this time on a weekday morning, having clearly timed the visit to catch Anselmo without the excuse of a Sunday's leisure to soften the encounter. He brought with him a younger man in a city suit, introduced only as my associate, who carried a leather folder and said almost nothing throughout the entire visit, which Anselmo understood immediately to be its own kind of message, that Braulio had come prepared this time, with someone whose silent presence was meant to suggest legal weight, even if the man never opened his mouth. "Cousin," Braulio said, dispensing with any pretense of warmth this time. "I've had the chance since my last visit to look into a few things. Land records, the status of your affairs. I understand you've made some arrangements regarding this property." "I have," Anselmo said. He was seated on the porch, as he had been 8 months before, though this time Pilar was not asleep in his lap but sitting cross-legged on the step below him, playing with the wooden horse he had some weeks earlier taken from Raphael's shelf and given to her outright, telling her it had waited long enough for a child to actually play with it. Tomas and Ines stood near the door, and Rosa Elena had come to stand beside Anselmo's chair rather than in the doorway this time, a small shift in positioning that Braulio's associate noted with a flicker of his eyes, though Braulio himself seemed not to register it at all. "I'll be direct," Braulio said. "I know about the agreement you filed with Ferreira's office. I know it names this woman and her children as heirs to the grove. And I want you to understand, cousin, that a document like that will not survive contact with a real courtroom. A widow arrives at your gate 8 months ago, and within a year, you've signed away 50 years of family land to people who share none of our blood? Any judge in this province will see that for what it plainly is." "And what is it plainly?" Anselmo asked, his voice even. "Undue influence on a lonely old man," Braulio said, without hesitation, as though he had rehearsed the phrase in the car on the drive out. "I don't say this to be cruel, cousin. I say it because it's the truth. A judge will see clearly enough, whatever fine words your lawyer has written into that agreement. Anselmo reached into the pocket of his jacket and withdrew a folded set of papers he had, in fact, been carrying with him for exactly this occasion, ever since Ferreira had warned him, months before, that a second visit from Braulio was likely once the arrangement became known. He handed them across without standing, without raising his voice, without giving Braulio's associate the satisfaction of seeing him rattled.
"You'll find in there," Anselmo said, "a letter from Dr. Ibarra, dated the same week I signed the agreement, attesting to my full mental competence at the time of signing. You'll find witnessed signatures from 2 men in this town who have no relationship to the Duarte family and no benefit whatsoever from the arrangement. Men your associate is welcome to interview himself if he doubts their honesty."
You'll find a full accounting of the labor performed by Rosa Elena and her children over the past 14 months, verified against my own ledgers, going back to a harvest during which I suffered a cardiac episode, and this family kept my life's work from ruin while I sat helpless on this very porch. And you'll find, on the very first page, a statement in my own words, witnessed and notarized, explaining that this agreement was my idea, brought to Ferreira's office by my own hand,
with no member of this family present in the room when I first proposed it.
Braulio's associate had begun almost involuntarily to read through the papers as Anselmo spoke, his expression shifting by small degrees from professional blankness to something more careful.
"I am 75 years old, Braulio," Anselmo went on. "Not 75 and foolish. I buried a wife and a son in this house, and I spent 11 years alone believing that was simply what remained of my life. When this family arrived, they did not ask me for anything I did not choose, freely and with clear eyes to give. What you are calling undue influence, any honest court will call exactly what it is: a debt repaid in full to the people who have earned it.
You may take those papers to whatever lawyer you like, in whatever city you like, and you will find, I am told by a man who has handled 3 generations of this town's disputes, that there is very little room in them for the argument you're hoping to make." For a long moment, Braulio said nothing. His associate had by now finished reading and was refolding the papers with a care that suggested he, at least, had already reached a professional conclusion about their strength, one he seemed reluctant to voice in front of his employer.
"You would choose them over your own family," Braulio said finally,
and for the first time since his arrival there was something genuinely bitter in his voice, something that suggested the calculation had, at some point, curdled into an actual grievance.
"Strangers who wandered up your road 8 months ago."
"They are not strangers," Anselmo said quietly.
"They stopped being strangers the first week they were here, when a boy of 11 had the honesty to show me evidence against a worker I trusted, including every fact that made his own family look better by comparison, because his mother taught him that the truth mattered more than the advantage a lie might buy him. They stopped being strangers when a girl of 8 took my hand in a room I hadn't opened in 11 years and said nothing at all,
because she understood, better than most grown people I have known, that some griefs only need witnessing. They stopped being strangers when their mother ran my press for 2 weeks with her own hands while I lay useless in a chair, and never once, not once, Braulio, suggested that this entitled her to anything beyond what I had already offered freely. You sent me 2 letters in 6 years, and both of them asked after my land before they asked after my health. I know the difference between blood and family, cousin. I have learned it rather late in my life, but I have learned it well." Braulio stood very still for a moment, his jaw working, and then, without another word, he took the folded papers back from his associate, tucked them under his arm as though he might yet find some use for them, and turned toward his car. At the gate he paused, looking back once at the small group on the porch, the old man, the woman standing beside his chair, the 3 children watching with expressions that ranged from wary to openly triumphant. And something in his face, for just a moment, looked less like calculation and more like a man realizing, too late, that he had misjudged the terrain entirely. "I won't trouble you again, cousin," he said finally, and there was, beneath the stiffness of the words, something that might almost have been shame. He got into his car and drove away, and this time no one on the porch doubted that the matter was, at last, truly finished. Later that evening, once the children had gone to bed, Rosa Elena asked Anselmo quietly whether he thought Braulio might still find some other way to make trouble down the road, some avenue Ferreira's careful papers had failed to anticipate. Anselmo considered the question for a long moment before answering that a man like Braulio measured every fight by the odds of winning it, and that he had just watched those odds collapse in front of witnesses whose testimony would only strengthen with time rather than weaken it. That the true victory of that afternoon lay not simply in the papers Ferreira had drafted, but in the fact that 4 children old enough to remember every word of it had stood on that porch and watched a greedy man be met with nothing but calm, documented, unshakable truth. The years that followed unspooled the way years do when a household has finally found its settled shape, not without their small griefs and difficulties, but without the particular anxious watchfulness that had marked the family's first uncertain months. Tomas grew into the 16-year-old his childhood arithmetic had always promised he would become. Tall now, with his father's steady way of looking at things sharpened by 5 years of managing a real ledger rather than a boy's private notebook. He had taken over the full bookkeeping of the press house by his 14th year, expanded the operation's sales to 2 additional markets in neighboring towns by his 15th, and had begun, in his 16th, quietly teaching himself the fundamentals of contract law from books borrowed from Ferreira's own shelf, with an eye, he told Anselmo one evening, toward making certain that no cousin, however distant or determined, would ever again find room to threaten what this family had built together. Inés, at 13, had grown from a child who left small offerings at the foot of a leaning tree into a young woman with a genuine gift for design, sketching new labels for the press house's bottles that had, in the past year alone, nearly doubled the price the juice fetched at the coastal markets, where buyers now specifically asked for the Vega bottles with the orange bird, a small painted bird on each label, wings spread mid-flight, that Inés had insisted on including without ever fully explaining why, though Anselmo, seeing it for the first time, had needed to sit down for a moment before he trusted his voice enough to tell her how he knew that image. And Pilar, 9 years old now, could walk the 14 rows of the grove blindfolded and name every tree by the particular character of its leaning, its scarring, its yield. She had, from her earliest years in that house, absorbed the grove the way other children absorb a native language, without ever quite remembering a time before she knew it. And she had taken, in the past 2 years, to spending her evenings in the room that had once belonged to a boy she never met, not out of any morbid fascination, but because she had decided, with the clear-eyed practicality of a child who has grown up surrounded by love rather than scarcity, that Raphael's old shelf of carved horses deserved a caretaker, and she had appointed herself to the position without asking anyone's permission, exactly as she had once climbed, uninvited and unafraid, into an old man's lap on a porch 8 years before. Anselmo, for his part, grew old in the particular way of a man who has made his peace with the shape his life finally took. More slowly than the years before Rosa Elena's arrival had suggested he might, his heart giving him only occasional trouble in the years that followed his first episode, managed carefully by a doctor's instructions, and, more than that, by a household that would not permit him to overwork himself the way he once had, back when there had been no one to notice or to care. He was 82 years old, and it was a Tuesday in late autumn, the harvest just finished and the press house quiet after its season's work, when he called the family together in the front room. Rosa Elena, now 41, her dark hair threaded through with gray she wore without vanity or apology. Tomas, 23, home from the neighboring town where he had opened a second small press operation of his own, modeled entirely on his adoptive grandfather's methods. Inés, 20, visiting from the coast, where she had begun selling her label designs to 3 other Grove families besides their own. And Pilar, 17, who had never once, in 13 years, needed to be told twice how much this family and this land meant, because she had never known any other way of understanding either.
Anselmo had been unwell for some days, a tiredness settling into him that even the doctor's careful attention could not fully explain away as anything other than what it plainly was. Not a crisis, but an ending, arriving the way most true endings do, without drama, simply as the slow completion of something that had been approaching for some time.
"I want to tell you something," he said, from the chair by the window, where he had taken in recent weeks to spending most of his days, while I still have the strength to say it properly, rather than leaving it for Ferreira's papers to say for me. He looked at each of them in turn, at Rosa Elena first, longest, the woman who had walked 6 miles down a dirt road with her back straight and had never, in 13 years, let it bend since. At Tomas, who had learned honesty was worth more than advantage before he was old enough to fully understand the lesson himself. At Inés, whose small painted bird now marked every bottle this grove produced. At Pilar, who had fallen asleep in his arms on a porch when she was 4 years old and had never, in any way that mattered, truly left it since.
14 hectares, he said. 312 trees, though I dare say it's closer to 340 now, with what Tomas has planted these past years. A press house, a name in this valley that took my father and myself together nearly 100 years to build, honestly. None of it was ever going to mean anything in the end, sitting empty in a house with no one to pass it to. I spent 11 years believing that emptiness was simply what my life had become,
that Raphael's death had closed a door that would never open again. He paused, his breathing a little labored, and Rosa Elena moved to help him, but he waved her off gently, wanting to finish this in his own time, his own words.
I was wrong. The door was not closed. It was only waiting for the right family to come and open it themselves. And you did. You walked 6 miles to do it. And you have walked every mile since without once looking back at what it cost you, or forward toward what it might earn you. This grove is yours. It has been yours in every way that matters since the week Tomas showed me a dishonest ledger and chose truth over advantage. The papers only make official what was already true in every way that counts. Care for this land the way you have cared for me, and it will care for you and yours long after I am only a name on the deed. He asked then that they open the door to Raphael's room one last time, and Pilar, understanding without being told, went and brought back the small carved horse with the chipped ear, the first one Anselmo had ever made, and placed it in his hands. He held it for a long moment, his thumb moving over the worn paint the way it had moved over it 40 years before, when the hands that first held it belonged to a boy who would grow only to 19.
"Tell him," Anselmo said softly, to no one and to everyone, "that his brothers and sisters finally came home. Tell him the crib was used after all, in its own way, that a family slept under this roof and grew up loved, exactly as he would have wanted for whoever came after him."
In those last 3 days, the household moved around him with a quiet, practiced tenderness that none of them had ever needed to learn from anyone but each other. Rosa Elena sat with him through each night, reading aloud from the same worn Bible that had once been Emiliano's mother's, not because Anselmo had ever been a particularly devout man, but because he told her on the second night that he found comfort simply in the sound of her voice filling the room, the way a house feels less empty for having someone speak in it, whatever the words happen to be. Tomas rode into town twice daily to fetch the doctor, refusing, even at 23, to delegate the errand to anyone else, as though some part of him were still the 11-year-old boy racing the length of a grove to save this same man's life, determined that if the ending could not be prevented,
it would at least not be met with anything less than everything he had to give.
Ines sat for long hours at the foot of the bed sketching, quietly, not out of any coldness, but because it was the only way she had ever known how to sit with grief without being crushed by it. And when Anselmo asked on the final morning to see what she had drawn, she showed him a page filled entirely with small birds, wings spread, dozens of them, crowding the paper the way the last few years had crowded a life that had once held almost nothing at all. He died 3 days later, in the early morning hours before the roosters, before the light, at the same hour he had woken every day for the better part of 50 years, quietly in his own bed, with Rosa Elena holding one hand and Pilar the other, Tomás and Inés standing close enough to touch his shoulder, all four of them present in a way that no blood relation had troubled themselves to be in 11 long years before this family walked up his road. They buried him beside Dolores and Rafael in the small cemetery outside town, and the whole of Santa Rosalia came to see it done. Because in the years since Rosa Elena's arrival, Anselmo Vega had become known, once again, not as the lonely old man of the grove, but as a man surrounded, at the end, by exactly the family he deserved. Beto and Chucho stood together near the back of the gathered crowd, both gray-haired themselves by then, having worked the grove for a combined total of nearly 40 years between them. And it was Chucho who remarked afterward to anyone who would listen that he had never in his life seen a man's death draw so many people who owed him nothing and had simply loved him anyway. Even the schoolmaster came, and the doctor from the Crossroads settlement, and old Ferreira himself, leaning now on a cane nearly as worn as the one Dolores had once carved, who told Rosa Elena quietly at the graveside that in 40 years of practicing law in that province, he had rarely drafted a document he was prouder to have written than the agreement that made her family's claim to that grove unshakable. The grove passed, exactly as the paper specified, to Rosa Elena Duarte and her 3 children, and in the years that followed, it grew rather than diminished. 340 trees became 410, 1 press house became 2, and the small painted bird on every bottle's label became, across 2 provinces, a mark that buyers came specifically to seek out. Though few of them ever knew the full story of the man whose son had once dreamed of growing the biggest oranges in the whole province, or of the family who had finally made that long-buried promise come true, in their own way, on their own terms. Raphael's room was never locked again. The crib stayed in its corner, and in time, when Pilar herself married and brought her own first child home to the grove that had raised her, it was that very crib, repaired, polished, its once uns rockers finally worn smooth by real use, that held a new generation of the family Anselmo Vega had once believed in 11 years of solitary grief he would never have again. The small carved horse with the chipped ear went with the child too, set on a new shelf in a new room, and Pilar made certain, every single year on the anniversary of Anselmo's death, to tell her own children the whole story from the beginning. The 6-mile walk, the sleeping child in an old man's lap, the door that had stayed shut for 11 years, until an 8-year-old girl found a key she was never meant to find, so that the family's youngest members would grow up knowing exactly whose patience and whose grief had made their good fortune possible, and would never mistake what they had inherited for anything less than what it truly was. Not charity, but love, earned honestly, on both sides, one difficult and ordinary day at a time. So tell me, which moment touched your heart the most? Was it Pilar climbing uninvited into a grieving old man's lap and falling asleep there, breaking 11 years of silence in a single trusting gesture? Was it Tomás running the length of that grove to save the life of a man who was, at the time, still a stranger to him? Or was it Anselmo, at the very end, asking his family to tell his lost son
that the crib had finally been used after all. Tell me in the comments. I read them all.
And if this story touched your soul, subscribe to Alma en Historias, because there's always a story waiting for you here.